Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ARF Brown Bag event for this week. Still in our virtual Zoom room, and I guess for those of you out there on YouTube. I'm Jordan Brown. I'm a grad student in anthro here at UC Berkeley, and the co-presenter along with Lucy Gill of the ARF Brown Bag series this semester. Just want to flag before we get into our talk that if anybody's got any announcements, please feel free to put those in the YouTube chat, and I will relay them after the talk. General ARF community announcements, so on. Next week we will have a talk yet to be announced, but I hear Meg Conkey is cooking up something excellent for us, so look out for a description of that. In the next few days. And I'll begin here with a land acknowledgement modeled on that developed by the Native American Student Development Office in partnership with the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We consider this a working formulation to be replaced with language reflecting the particular position of the ARF community and developed in collaboration with appropriate stakeholders. The archaeological research facility sits on the territory of Huachun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We hereby acknowledge that this land remains of great importance to the Ohlone people, that every member of the ARF community benefits from the continued occupation of this land, and that it is our responsibility to support Indigenous sovereignty and hold the University of California accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. So this week we have with us Dr. Leigh Anne Lieberman, the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Alexandria Archive Institute, and also Open Context, which of course has Berkeley roots here. Dr. Lieberman is an archaeologist whose research explores how and why artifacts and spaces were recycled and repurposed, especially in the ancient Roman world. She has taught at the university, secondary and primary levels in the US and Italy. Over the past couple of years, she directed the development of the Digital Humanities Initiative at the Claremont Colleges, creating a robust curriculum in the digital methods for faculty, staff, and students. She currently serves as the manager of data and information resources for the Pompeii Archaeological Research Project, Porta Stabia, where she's leading the publication of the artifact assemblages from the excavation. Also as the head of materials for the Tharros Archaeological Research Project, and as the data management director for the American Excavations at Morgantina, Contrada Agnese Project. She is a new ARF research associate and recently joined the nonprofit Alexandria Archive Institute, where she will be building institutional partnerships with libraries, museums, and other cultural heritage organizations in order to develop sustainable initiatives around open data. She'll be integrating much of this expertise and experience for us in her talk today. So in recent years, the study of ancient artifacts has moved beyond straightforward typologies, descriptions, and quantifications. New approaches to the analysis of material culture, including methods of geospatial referencing, artifact agency, object biography, and statistical analysis of large data sets, have all drawn attention to the myriad ways in which objects could be used and reused, deposited and redeposited in the ancient world. In this presentation, Dr. Lieberman outlines just a few of the methods that characterize her work studying the artifacts at Pompeii, Porta Stabia, and Morgantina, Contrada Agnese Project, and at Tharros. So there will be a lot to cover today. It's very exciting. And if you've got questions throughout the talk, please place them in the YouTube chat and I will relay them after Dr. Lieberman's presentation. And without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Lieberman for what's the coolest thing you've ever found? Stories about small finds in urban contexts.
Jordan, thanks for that great introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, slides look good, hopefully. So first and foremost, I really want to thank everyone for Zooming in today. There are many other ways to spend your lunch break, so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with me. I also really want to express how excited I am that I, as Jordan said, have just joined the ARF community as a research associate, and I'm really looking forward to meeting other members of the group in the near future. Every archaeologist has experienced some version of this story. You're sitting on a plane making small talk with your neighbor, you've just come home for the holidays and you're catching up with relatives, you're at your oldest friend's birthday party and someone asks what you do for a living, and then suddenly, oh wow, you're an archaeologist. That's so neat. I always wanted to be an archaeologist, well, when I was a kid. You must have left your fedora at home tonight, right? Hey, what's the coolest thing you've ever found? And I don't know about you, but this question always makes me freeze. I don't think I've ever given the same answer twice. I absolutely hate picking favorites. But more than that, it's a difficult question for me because there's really not just one thing. Rather, it's the stories we can begin to tell about the ancient world through the artifacts that I find fascinating. To me, the artifacts are characters in the plots of complex and riveting historical narratives. So I take that question very seriously, and a little too seriously for casual conversation sometimes. But today provides a really good opportunity to explore that question a bit deeper. I mentioned in the abstract to my talk that Jordan just alluded to that I'm going to be drawing on my experience working with material culture at 3 sites: Pompeii, Morgantina, and Tharros. In reality, we're really only going to have time to focus on 2 of these sites today. And given that my role at Morgantina is less directly connected to material analysis, I thought I wouldn't include that in today's talk. But that said, many of the questions that drive the research objectives of the American Excavations at Morgantina Contrada Agnese Project are definitely in line with what we'll be talking about at the other 2 sites. So I'm eager for that to come up in the discussion that follows in the question through YouTube. So today, we're going to venture far from our kitchens, from our bedrooms, from our home offices to 2 Roman cities where I've worked. The first city is Pompeii, the urbs Romana par excellence. I've worked with the Pompeii Archaeological Research Project, Porta Stabia, or PARPS, since I first started studying archaeology. One of the most common questions, in addition to what's the coolest thing you've ever found, one of the most common questions that I field when I tell people I work at Pompeii is something like, Pompeii, hasn't that site been completely excavated yet? And the short answer is no. Only about 2/3 of the site has been fully uncovered down to the layer that was visible when Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the city in CE 79. The longer answer is that regardless, most teams presently working at Pompeii, including PARPS, are more interested in excavating the pre-eruption city, in exploring how the urban center developed over time before it came to an abrupt end in the late 1st century CE. Since 2005, PARPS has conducted systematic excavations and architectural analysis in 2 city blocks, located in the southern part of the city, next to the Porta Stabia gate and close to the city's theater district. The original excavation of the area in the 19th century cleared down to the CE 79 eruption level and revealed a non-elite working class neighborhood, notably lacking any of the atrium-style houses that Pompeii is so famous for. In a field which was focused for so long on the study of the 1%, the elite, these 2 city blocks have proven to be an ideal location to trace changing patterns of property use and ownership in a decidedly non-elite neighborhood. An initial building boom of the 2nd century BCE resulted in a district that was predominantly industrial. The Porta Stabia neighborhood has yielded evidence for fish salting in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE in the form of these large vats that are placed at the front of properties, tanning or leather production in the form of 4 vats that we found at the back of one of our properties, and the production of small, coarse juglets in the 3rd century BCE in the form of a kiln. The neighborhood in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE was thus largely of an industrial character, focused on production. In the Augustan period, however, the nature of this neighborhood shifted. Industrial features were dismantled and replaced by commercial spaces, shops, restaurants, identified here by the installation of bar counters, illustrating a wholesale shift in the character and the social history of the neighborhood. The second city that we're going to look at today is Tharros, an urbs Romana that I'm guessing might be new to many of you. It was to me when I began working there just 2 years ago, when, building on many of the precedents we'd established at Pompeii, colleagues and I began the Tharros Archaeological Research Project, or TARP. Situated on the west coast of Sardinia, the city of Tharros served as an important point in the network of trade routes between the ports of Spain, North Africa, and Gaul. While best known for its rich Punic tombs, our new project targets the city itself, particularly its retail and residential quarters. We're also asking questions about the socioeconomic fabric of the city, questions that haven't been the focus of previous research campaigns at Tharros. These include questions of diet and consumption, questions of waste management, and urban renewal. One of the overall goals is to be able to compare our results and interpretations of our work to that which we've done at Pompeii, so that a more contextualized picture of Tharros can emerge, and so that we can better connect the city to some broader aspects of Mediterranean history. At both Pompeii and Tharros, I usually work with a team a bit removed from our trenches, in the nearby storerooms or labs, studying the material culture that has been unearthed by the members of the team that are excavating. I take material culture to include all artifactual and ecofactual remains discovered during the course of an excavation, from worked bone pendants to cuttlefish remains, which you can see here on the left, from architectural terracottas to fragments of painted wall plaster in the center, from iron blooms to bronze coins on the right, and last but certainly not least, pottery. Now, I'm guessing that at least a few of you watching might be looking at the images I've just shared, and you might be thinking, those definitely don't look like the coolest thing she's ever found while excavating. In fact, those artifacts don't even look particularly nice. And in fact, you're not wrong about the not nice part. The study of ancient material culture has for so long been dominated by the charismatic artifacts, the pieces that hold pride of place in museum galleries, the pieces that we have no difficulty calling art. This is obvious when you open up any textbook about the ancient world and take a look at the images that they've chosen to illustrate the pages. It's obvious when you see the content posted by museum collections worldwide on social media, which is how we're all likely engaging with museums these days. In contrast, my work, like this fantastic Twitter account I discovered last year, prioritizes the less appealing artifacts, the fragmented, the difficult to understand. It's my goal that by highlighting these small, seemingly unremarkable finds to tell some big stories about the ancient world, we can bring new life to artifacts that would have been otherwise overlooked in busy storerooms. So that's my plan for today. I'm going to highlight some small, seemingly unremarkable finds to tell some big stories. Regarding the particular finds, I'm going to limit myself to types of pottery, but you could reasonably be wondering, well, why pottery? Why not some of those other classes that you just illustrated? I chose pottery because it easily represents the most abundant category of material culture to have survived from the ancient world. Archaeologists spend an absurd amount of time every summer washing, sorting, reconstructing, quantifying, qualifying, and illustrating potsherds. Pottery studies have consequently enjoyed a prominent position in the field of Roman archaeology. Still, if you can imagine the ancient galleries of a museum that you visited, rarely are the generic coursewares, the charred cookwares, the broken transport vessels actually featured in the galleries. So I think there's an opportunity here to turn our attention to a few less charismatic examples today. Regarding the stories, there are 4 short ones that I'd like to share. First, setting the stage, in which we'll outline some of the methodological precedents and techniques for studying material culture. Second, artifact life histories, in which we'll consider the close, detailed analysis of individual objects and the value of writing artifact biographies. Third, context is everything, in which we'll explore some of the contextual complexities that necessarily influence how our artifactual assemblage must be interpreted. And fourth, the digital potential, in which we'll reflect briefly on how pottery has traditionally been studied, and we'll imagine how these methods might evolve given the accessibility of new computational tools. So, chapter 1, setting the stage. When we think about the origins of archaeological methods, until not so long ago, archaeology was a lot less scientific and way more, at best, antiquarian and at worst, adventurous. Following the discovery of sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and the start of their excavation, funded by Italian royalty in the mid-18th century, Artifacts uncovered at these sites were consistently removed to private, namely royal and elite collections. One important consequence of the early excavations was the advertisement of the work. As the world beyond the Italian peninsula learned of the wondrous towns that had been buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the 1st century, young, white, male aristocrats from Northern Europe made a point of heading to Italy, embarking on a so-called grand tour as part of their classical education and acquiring souvenirs along the way. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that treasure hunting in the Vesuvian cities was put to an end. At this time, the application of a more systematic, rigorously documented method of archaeological practice not only changed the way we physically excavated ancient spaces, but also changed the way we valued ancient material culture. No longer were artifacts prized primarily for their aesthetic quality and their association with an aristocratic rite of passage. Rather, artifacts were seen more readily as tools by which we might be able to write detailed histories about the ancient world. But the myriad ways in which we use those tools have certainly changed over time. The most conventional method still used today to study and organize artifacts grew out of the 19th century scientific approaches to object analysis. Excavated objects are organized into categories based on idiosyncratic combinations of material, form, and function. And you can see an example here from just 2014, which, albeit in Italian, highlights a number of different types of pottery, architectural terracottas and figurines, amphora, glass, and numerous other categories. Each distinct category in this kind of schema would be entrusted to a different specialist who would create a detailed typology, which would form the basis of an artifact's chapter or section of a final publication, if it appears at all. What's missing from this traditional structure is a more nuanced view of the function that these objects might have served. In the early 20th century, Harlan Smith developed a functionalist approach to artifact analysis with categories like the preparation of food, the tools used by men, tools used by women. You can see a couple of those here. And he developed this system to present and analyze the artifacts he had gathered at the Fox Farm site in northern Kentucky. Roman archaeologists, however, did not begin to adopt this functionalist method of artifact classification until Nina Crummey's 1983 publication of the artifacts from the Romano-British fort at Colchester. It's important to note that an exclusively functionalist approach will present artifacts as they were intended to be used. In fact, both excavation publications and museum displays, the intended use of an object is almost always prioritized. While Crummey's categories remain highly influential, scholars continue to experiment with other ways to organize and think about objects. One such method is to present artifacts by rooms or sometimes by assemblage within the room. And this kind of spatial approach can be especially effective for deposits produced by, say, the destruction of Olympus at the hands of Philip II of Macedon, as you can see in this example here, or the eruption that destroyed Pompeii, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. However, this approach falls short in most urban contexts, as it fails to account for the varied and complex formation processes that produced the subsurface deposits in most ancient cities. Over 40 years ago, Michael Schiffer introduced an influential model for object life histories that addressed the movement of artifacts between systemic or use life and archaeological contexts, usually post-use depositions. More recently, Ted Pena, who many of you will know as an ARF-affiliated faculty member, adopted this model to account for the reclamation and reuse or second life of selected materials. And we're going to come back to this fundamental model in just a few minutes when I get to chapter 2. Work by members of the PARPS team, notably Stephen Ellis, Allison Emerson, and Kevin Dykes, has gone even further to demonstrate the complex formation processes that created the majority of the deposits in our neighborhood. These studies recognize that waste from routine activities was often discarded into extramural refuse heaps, several of which have been identified around Pompeii, including one just outside the Porta Stabia, only meters away from our own neighborhood. These refuse heaps would have provided a ready source of fill material for a range of construction activities, the very kind of activities that produce the bulk of subsurface deposits at most urban sites. This work suggests not only that most of our artifacts were excavated from post-primary deposits, but also that many of these deposits originated in other properties or even other neighborhoods. So rather than focus on the artifact as a signifier of activity in a space, we argue that highlighting the spatial, temporal, and depositional complexities of archaeological contexts can not only encourage us to give new life to objects that have long been overlooked, but can also help us reconstruct the priorities that governed the development and social history of the urban spaces that we study. And we're going to come back to this influential model in chapter 3. As a final word in this chapter, I want to give credit to Chris Motz and Kat Baker, who I've been thinking through this work with a lot over the last few years as we work through the material that we've encountered at PARPS. But it's also important to note that there are still today a variety of priorities to consider when studying ancient material culture. Fortunately, with the rapid development of and adoption of computational tools, we can publish digital data sets that enable users to set their own priorities. Nevertheless, in what follows, I'm going to highlight some of the standard practices that have characterized my work at this site and at Tharros. So, chapter 2, Artifact Life Histories. The foundational exercise of any introductory art history course is going to be the close formal analysis, an activity that prioritizes really looking at and describing objects, be they works of art or buildings or artifacts. In other words, close formal analysis relies strictly on your ability to read an object and make detailed interpretations about it based on what you see and what embodied knowledge you bring to the process. This embodied knowledge, it's important to realize, is based on your previous experience and it builds up over time. In other words, you get more comfortable performing close formal analyses the more you do them. And that's what I tell my students in my intro art history course. Archaeologists are constantly performing close formal analyses of the spaces and the artifacts we encounter when working in the field. Sometimes an object of inquiry may seem like it's something you've seen before, but quite often you encounter spaces and artifacts for which you have no real clear point of reference. So in that case, you return to the basics. You look closely and you describe what's the object's shape, what's its size, its color, what material is it made out of, what's its condition, is it complete, is it a fragment, is it part of a larger whole, can you see any repairs? Once you've addressed these descriptive questions, the basics I call them, you can begin to apply your embodied knowledge to this analysis process. Have I seen other objects like this before? Can I tell how it was made? Who would have made it? Who would have used it? Do I know how it was intended to be used? How it ended up being used? If I were going to write a biography about this object, how many different chapters or phases might it contain? A life history or a biographical approach to the study of ancient material culture seeks to understand the ways in which artifacts become imbued with meaning through the social interactions that they're involved in. In this way, artifacts are not best understood as static objects at a single point on the timeline of their existence. Rather, the cycles of manufacture, use, reuse, and discard need to inform our analysis. Not to mention, it's really fun to write biographies of things. So, given the sheer quantity of artifacts that we uncover and document every field season, for example, at Tharros in 2009, during just a 5-week field season, we excavated over 30,000 sherds, weighing a total of 800 pounds. That's a lot of pottery. Given that sheer quantity, a detailed account of each individual object is near impossible. And our work would never be published if we set a bar that high for ourselves. But when we do have the opportunity to slow down and look closely at the artifacts that make up our assemblage, we can begin to glimpse some really interesting stories about the use and reuse of objects in the ancient world. I'd like to spend just a bit of time doing that today, slowing down and looking closely at some artifacts that I became pretty obsessed with the last time I was in the field at Tharros. These are objects that I encountered before at Pompeii and Morgantina, but at Tharros, we seem to be finding them in quantities that I had never experienced at either of the other two sites. Sure enough, when I looked at the numbers at the end of the summer in 2019, we'd identified 52 in just a single year at Tharros. After 8 seasons of excavation in Pompeii, we had only 44. So what can we say about them? For those members of the audience who work in the Mediterranean, they may look familiar, but they might be entirely new to some others of you. So I'll give you just a few seconds to look closely and to think through some of those questions that we outlined before. Quick little thinking exercise. We generally call these types of artifacts sherd discs, and we know that they were recycled from pots that had likely broken or gone out of fashion. Regarding those original pots, it's often not possible to say much about the shape or size, so our biography is only going to be able to go back so far. If we go beyond the scope of our close formal analysis, an examination of the fabric or the clay of the disc under a microscope can help us determine where the pot was made. And if that place of origin is far from the find spot, we might be encouraged to think about the mechanics of commercial trade and transport that brought it from there to its final resting place. The edges of these are not often particularly polished, suggesting that the reworking could have been a rather inexact practice. In other words, the ancient manufacturers and the ancient users didn't seem to really care if the edges of the reworked disc were a bit rough, and these might be things that you noted during your observations. Beyond this starting point, though, the footnote to this whole exercise is that there's no real consensus about how these might have been used in antiquity. Moreover, the variety in the sizes of the discs and the shape, type of vessel from which they were created perhaps suggests that sherd discs may have served a variety of functions. While at first this might seem pretty daunting, right? We as students and scholars really want there to often be a single clear-cut answer. It actually gives us a tremendous amount of freedom to think creatively about an artifact's life history instead. So let's go through just a couple hypothetical uses for these. Some of our sherd discs, scholars argue, were likely used as stoppers to vessels. This might be an especially attractive argument for thick sherd discs, those that were likely reworked from amphoras themselves and then used as stoppers to amphoras, these large transport vessels. Capping a vessel with one of these sherd discs would have involved setting it into the mouth of the container and covering it with some kind of sealant, plaster, or clay that would dry, set, and hold the stopper in place. During the field season, during our close formal analysis of discs that might have been used as stoppers, we might even be able to identify traces of that sealant if they're not found in situ on top of that jar. Some of them, others propose, may have been used as game pieces. We know that many games in antiquity that were played using small discs called pessoi in ancient literary sources. And this seems like an especially likely function for examples that were chosen specifically because of their color variation. And you see 2 examples of that here. Say a sherd with black charring or a salt slip on one side and a red matte finish on the other. Some of them, others speculate, may have been used as the ancient equivalent of toilet paper, which seems topical given the pandemic hoarding last year that left many of us running from store to store, hoping to get the last available roll. There's also evidence in literary sources for pessoi that were used as wipes, and I'm not going to encourage you to think too hard about the mechanics of that. You wouldn't necessarily be able to know if a sherd disc was used like toilet paper just from close formal analysis of the artifact itself. It isn't totally unreasonable to propose such a function for artifacts that are found deep in latrines, for instance, but we also know that all sorts of waste was discarded into latrines. If mineralized excrement is identified during the examination of the disc under a microscope, as is the case with certain examples, you may begin to build support for this hypothesis. But regardless, these are just 3 of many proposals for how these objects might have been used in the ancient world. Returning to where I began a few minutes ago, I'm really interested in figuring out why we seem to have so many more sherd discs at Tharros than the other sites where I've worked. Be they stoppers or game pieces or toilet paper or even something else entirely. I don't have an answer to this question yet, but I think that the first step towards finding an answer relies on this close formal analysis of the objects themselves, a process that necessarily forms the foundation of any study of material culture. But to move beyond that foundation, let's turn to chapter 3, context is everything. The final phase of any artifact's life history is the story of where, for instance, in the southernmost property, when, for instance, in the layer that was deposited in the 2nd century BCE, and how, for instance, in the fill of a tank that was put out of use. So spatial, chronological, and taphonomic, the context of where an artifact was uncovered by archaeologists. By prioritizing context in the analysis of artifacts, we can come to a more nuanced interpretation of how everyday objects were used, discarded, and reclaimed in antiquity. And this has been one of my major takeaways from my work at Pompeii. To see this in action, let's consider some of the pottery from the southeastern property in the Porta Stabia neighborhood that we looked at just a little while ago, namely miniature cups that were found there in very coarse fabric, in various contexts that we're going to go through in a minute. When you think of miniatures in the ancient world, you often think of offerings to the gods left in sanctuaries or included in ritual deposits. This type of interpretation is predicated upon knowing where, when, and how an artifact was uncovered, a contextual analysis of that artifact. And while that information is not always available for objects excavated, say, in the mid-18th century, we're fortunate to have ready access to that information for artifacts uncovered by more modern excavations, usually. So let's think of the history of this space. You may remember in one of its early phases, the property was home to a kiln that would have been used for pottery production. The kiln had been largely destroyed by subsequent construction, but a reconstruction can help us imagine what it would have looked like when it was in use. That this workshop produced votive cups is suggested by the fact that several of our examples were discovered in the fill of the destroyed kiln and in a dump of discarded pottery nearby. At least some of the votive cups that make up our assemblage then are in no way indicative of ritual activity. Rather, they provide evidence for the types of craft activities and commercial habits that would have taken place in this space. Located just inside the Porta Stabia, this workshop would have seen a fair bit of foot traffic. One can imagine customers walking through the area, intending to stop at the shrine that was located just outside the gate, realizing that they need to purchase a small votive offering to dedicate there. The artists must have had this market in mind when deciding where to locate their workshop and their shop. Moreover, the dump of pottery consisted mostly of misfired or slightly defective pieces, suggesting that the workshop only sold the best of what was produced. In other words, there was no discount rack available, which can also speak to the fact that religious practice in the ancient world focused on performance and correctness. The dedication of a broken vessel at a shrine wouldn't have done the trick. Near the kiln, a small pit was identified. The pit was filled with organic materials, charcoal mixed with sand, and contained 9 miniature votive cups, exactly alike compared to the ones we just looked at. Unlike those in the fill of the kiln and the pottery dump, however, these cups were in perfect condition. There were no slight defects associated with them. These cups contained bread, small cakes, figs, walnuts, almonds, carob, beans, and contents that, along with the quality of the vessels, suggest that they were part of a ritual deposit. At least some of the votive cups then that make up our assemblage are very clearly indicative of ritual activity. This case study very conspicuously highlights the important role that context can and should play in our research concerning material culture. Knowing that typologically we can recognize these as votive cups is great, and that's a good start. But a contextual understanding of these artifacts encourages us to tell a potentially different story, one that allows us to reconstruct the priorities that governed the social and commercial history of urban spaces that we study. So after a close formal analysis of our artifacts and an approach that prioritizes context, Where do we go? The digital potential, and this is a really short chapter. We've already established that pottery easily represents the most abundant category of material culture to have survived from the ancient world. As I mentioned earlier, archaeologists spend an absurd amount of time every summer washing, sorting, reconstructing, and illustrating potsherds. Conventional systems for pottery analysis, which rely almost exclusively on the identification of patterns in fabric, type, and form by pottery specialists, are inefficiently time-consuming and frustratingly opaque to non-specialists and students. Moreover, the field has generally acknowledged in recent years, and I quote from an article by Lund in 2018, that the greatest assistance one could render a pottery expert would be to provide her or him with digital tools to help automate and speed up the work. I'm in the very early stages with colleagues from TARP of a machine learning project that aims to provide this kind of assistance using the material record from Tharros as a case study. Machine learning is an application of artificial intelligence by which algorithms automatically learn and improve from experience without being explicitly trained to do so. Machine learning models are used for medical diagnostics, for self-driving cars, for facial recognition, et cetera, et cetera. And while some scholars have already attempted to create the kinds of tools specifically for archaeologists, they usually focus their efforts on assemblages of complete artifacts from museum collections, rather than the fragmentary sherds that are more often unearthed by field archaeologists. What patterns do I want to program these machine learning models to start to recognize? First, patterns in form, which is our best marker of chronology and can also illustrate potential details about preference and diet. This part of the analysis process isn't necessarily difficult for scholars to do relatively consistently without advanced computational methods, but it is nevertheless an incredibly time-consuming activity that requires a tremendous amount of previous experience and embodied knowledge. Second, patterns in fabric and surface finish can inform us about trade and the sourcing of local materials for production. To complete this part of the analysis process consistently, you'd need to access a microscope and a really careful eye, so machine learning models might be able to provide that consistency more readily. Fortunately, we'd be able to build on a training data set from an already ongoing project by the Fabrics of the Central Mediterranean Project, or FACEM, so we wouldn't be starting from scratch here. Third, the patterns in condition, which can inform us about the life cycle of our pottery, residuality, intrusiveness, and recycling habits would be really important to get to the bottom of. This is the part of the analysis process that can frequently be overlooked or considered only as an afterthought. So I think that this kind of application would really enhance the work of scholars who study material culture in the ancient world. As I said, I'm only in the very early stages of this project, but my ultimate goal is to create a tool that will be useful for archaeologists across spatial and temporal boundaries. And I'm excited to see how this kind of project might change both the types of questions that we're encouraged to ask about the ancient world and the types of questions that we'll be able to answer. In the end, I hope these short stories today gave you an opportunity not only to leave your homes today, albeit just mentally and virtually, but also to imagine how some small, seemingly unremarkable artifacts, the kind that you might overlook at first glance, can be marshaled to tell some big stories about the ancient world. In the end, I've provided a really long and roundabout answer to the question, what's the coolest thing you've ever found? But I'm okay with that, and I hope you are too. So at this point, I would like to welcome any questions that you have, and I'm excited to see where the conversation goes from here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful talk. I'll echo the call for questions. Feel free to put them in the YouTube chat. Meanwhile, I see that Christine Hasdorf has a question, presumably about the artifacts that you spoke the most about. You should say, were they always found in pairs?
Oh, you know what? That picture is a little misleading. For those, what it is, it's a photograph of the front and the back. So each one of those would represent one artifact. But to that end, it's interesting to me, especially when you think about how some of these might have been used as game pieces when each side is so different, almost like a pawn on a checkerboard, right? Where you have those markings there.
Cool. Christine, do you have another question? Maybe the case, or maybe she has just not seen that I answered her yet, since she was on the YouTube with a little bit of a delay. Well, at any rate, if you do have another, feel free to put it in the chat. I will ask one of my own, just a quick tag on to the machine learning project you mentioned. Is that meant to be, I assume, sort of a supervised learning framework where you're using a training data set of things that have been characterized by analysts already? Yeah.
Yeah, and what we're trying to do now, so for the three different areas, the form, the fabric, and the condition, regarding form, we are currently building up a data set of published pottery typologies that are mostly now consisting of line drawings of sherds in Western Sardinia, and we'll branch beyond that at a certain point as well. For fabric, we're going to rely heavily on what's already been published in databases like FACEM. And then for the condition, we're still working out the mechanics of that. This is, right now, it's a lot of ideas and a lot of brainstorming that we're throwing at it, but we're up for suggestions. And if people have ideas or know people that are also working on this, I'd love to hear about that.
Great. A quick tack onto that is, will the analysis data set be sort of read in the form of line drawings, or would that be, is there a sort of photogrammetry aspect of things or that sort of thing?
Yeah, I would really love to be able to 3D scan and or take some photogrammetry models and pull them in. It's going to depend a lot on just where we throw the time into it, right? So the image that I showed before with the 3D scan, that's not our team that's doing that, that in that specific image, but that is work that we've done before. And I think that could prove incredibly valuable. And what I also want to do with this project is make it iterative, right? I would love to start with line drawings, work it up to 3D models, and write some white papers about where the pros and cons of each approach are in terms of time, in terms of your personnel management, and in terms of the results. So yes, and is the answer to that question, Jordan.
Yeah, great. Well, fun thing to talk about more. I am thinking about related things in a very different context of very old lithic artifacts. But, yeah, it's certainly some shared questions. So Christine does indeed have a follow-up question, which is, do these blanks occur in clusters, and what context do they turn up on most often?
Do the what occur in clusters?
She refers to them as blanks.
Oh, the shared disks. Not clusters per se. And in fact, when we do find them, they're scattered throughout. So it's not that we're finding any particular cache of them. But that's another thing that is it's so strange. Like, we have so many, but there's no particular patterns to where they're coming yet. And I say yet because at Tharros, we have only been excavating for one season. So maybe those patterns will develop over time.
Well, thank you. Another question in the YouTube chat here from Kinda Foggy. Did they pickle fish, vegetables, olives, or fruit? The mystery discs look like pickling weights designed to keep things submerged in brine. Not sure about the salt and spice availability back then.
Oh, interesting. There would have been pickling, but I've never heard that suggested for keeping things weighted. So that's something to look into for sure. I myself pickle, and I actually didn't know that you needed to weigh things down. So learn something new every day.
Yeah, I know, I really never thought about that. But I guess so, saltwater buoyancy situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, fun. There's some embodied knowledge for you. I've got another question here coming in from the Zoom chat, many chats. Can any quantification of other artifacts like amphorae help us understand the abundance of discs?
Yeah, I think they can. I think part of the issue that most projects come across when you think about how artifacts are processed and studied and stored, part of it comes down to who actually looks at what objects. So it goes back to what I was saying before about the different specialists that come in, and oftentimes the person that studies the amphorae is not going to speak right away with the person that handles these shard discs, and there's a delay in that communication there. So I think that there is something to be said for looking at that overlap. I think that I don't know if that entirely is going to account for the number that we have at Tharros, in part because the ones that we have at Tharros are not the big thick ones that were produced from amphorae. They're more the smaller ones that you might imagine for a game piece size. But yeah, I think that's definitely something to look into more for sure.
Cool, thank you. Christine adds in the chat, I assume in reference to the pickling, today people use smaller whole pots, at least in Crete. I hope I'm interpreting that correctly to be in reference to the pickling. A lot of pickling going on in such a pickle. To follow on to that point you make about the sort of many different silos in which we interpret our artifacts. I'm curious, in the context of the projects that you're working with, obviously you're working very heavily in sort of coordinating a lot of data. I'm curious what your sort of interaction with the excavators and other folks involved with the project is, and sort of how your sort of orientation towards the way you like to think about the data has impacted that.
Yeah, so for me, my roles have on every project have kind of been pulled in those two directions. Like on the one hand, I came in with an avid interest in artifacts and artifact analysis, and then the data kind of just happened incidentally. I was sitting next to, at Pompeii, our database administrator, John Walrot, in the tech tent. I was working with the artifacts. He was working on the database, and I kind of just asked one day if I could push the buttons, and went from there. And I think that one of the great consequences of that is that in thinking about how data is organized, you begin to see how integrated all the different components of a project are. And so even though each group is responsible for their own task and has their own timeline and has their own schedule and their own place, being at that helm and kind of seeing the data all come together allows you to think from a very early point in the project how it all might relate. And I think that for that reason, we've been really fortunate at all three projects to put a lot of time and energy, both sort of financial energy and personnel energy, into developing these really robust data structures so that we can start to have those conversations about how the different pieces of the puzzle connect a lot sooner. And I think before you had people using tablets and people using even computers on site, you would have those casual conversations that happen over dinner or happen over drinks, and that's great, and that's a great way for to build team camaraderie and to have people sort of think about the bigger picture, but it's not a good way to communicate data. And I think if we can figure out, and we've done a really good job of this so far, if we can figure out ways to automate those processes, right, and develop really robust methods for asynchronous communication of data, that can make those in-person moments a lot more valuable.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think a lot of people do tend to view those as either or propositions, which
Right.
is certainly not the case.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And from what I work, a few people at the PARPS project have talked about this in lectures and in publications, but what we found is that even though a lot of things are being pushed to the asynchronous channel, right, we're developing little visual cues and ways for people to leave messages for different teams in the database itself, it actually makes the in-person conversations richer, and it promotes that in-person moment in a really different way.
Yeah, that's very cool. Another question from Christine, following on to the shared discs. Have you asked local folks, particularly farmers, about these? Do they recognize them?
Not yet, but there is a survey project in the area, and our goal is to talk more with them. Everything kind of got put on hold with not going into the field last year, and it wasn't even a pattern that we recognized until we were out of the field. So I definitely want to engage with the local community and archaeologists in the local community, as well as just the community members, like you said. I think that's a great idea.
Cool. And yeah, I mean, I can imagine that articulating with the with sort of the data management aspect as well. You know, that's certainly something that's come up in a couple of other brown bags we've had. I'm particularly thinking of the one we did with Brinker Ferguson, talking about you know, making data structures that are, you know, also sort of follow. Gosh, I'm forgetting there's the FAIR principles and the CARE principles. I remembered it. But sort of having, you know, encompassing both, and thinking about how, you know, you make that data sort of speak not only in, you know, a site volume that happens decades down the line, and, you know, the people who were there working with you are, you know, never going to see it or something, you know.
Yeah, well, yeah, and being able to communicate that work to the community. So Tharros in particular, if you think about the pictures that I was showing before, it's right on the coast. So we get a lot of tourists there that are just constantly walking right up to our trenches and walking right up to our storeroom. And that's fantastic for us because we get to talk about our work with people that are there, you know, not necessarily coming from an archaeological background, people that just kind of happen on it. It also helps that our storeroom at Tharros is also shared with a local sea turtle rehabilitation clinic. So people mostly come looking for the sea turtles, but then we get to teach them a little bit of ancient Roman history as well.
That's a great collaboration that I have truly never considered even possible. Sea turtles going to bat for archaeology. All right, well, I think that brings us to the end of our time here.
From pickles to sea turtles.
Yeah. Exactly. That's a heck of a note to end on. All right. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. And let's give a big